My name is Kire from 11G, and today I'm going to be presenting about the fourth outcome of term 2, which is defending generalization of monetary policies. So what is monetary policies? They are regulations made by the central bank that is given to the commercial banks in order for the commercial banks to reach a certain goal, and all of the commercial banks as a whole will contribute to a certain economic goal. So this is the three current monetary policies that I chose to analyze. The first one is interest rate adjustments, and this is when the central bank is able to either increase or decrease their discount rates for products and or services, and that affects how commercial banks view it. And another way to describe it, it affects the interest rate for commercial banks. So the second one is open market, and open market is different from the traditional market. It typically doesn't have certain rules traditional market offers, and usually central banks are able to buy or sell securities in the open market, and that helps to control the economy, and it affects the money supply and short-term interest rates. It only affects short-term interest rates, not long-term interest rates, because the open market is not something that is permanent, meaning central banks will eventually need to go back to the traditional market. So the third one is reserve requirements. This is when central banks label different savings depending on how crucial it is, and it typically is labeled into two different groups. The first one is labeling which saving that is needed to pay commercial banks that central banks owe, and the second one is for sudden expenses. So this is the pros of current monetary policies. For interest rate adjustments, usually when central banks increase the discount rate, interest rate will also increase, so central banks get more profit. For open market, the pro is when central banks buy from the open market, they contribute to the economy growth, and when commercial banks buy from central banks, it also contributes to the economy, and it also benefits the central bank. It enables them to be free from old regulations from the traditional market that makes it hard for them to be flexible. They get to be free from the burden of market barriers, unfair licensing agreements, arbitrary taxes, and many more. Reserve requirements. So when central banks pay what they owe to commercial banks in a scheduled manner, commercial banks will trust central banks more, and they can be a long-term loyal customer, and it can also increase their chances of getting other loyal customers. The second pro is how central banks typically label which is more crucial, which savings are more crucial, which is clear that the saving to pay back what they owe is more crucial. So typically central banks don't change that. They don't use the savings to pay back what they owe. because they know how crucial it is. So in a way, they become more independent. These are the cons. So for interest rate adjustments, typically when discount rates are adjusted high by central bank, a lot of commercial banks demand the product, but central bank will have the tendency to slowly decrease the discount rates because they want to get more profit. And that is a con because commercial banks will spend more money. The second con is how when central banks increase the discount rates, a lot of people demand it, but in the environment perspective, it's not a positive thing because with more commercial banks demanding it, central banks will need to print more currency, and that will need more paper, and with more trees being cut down, it can eventually be scarce, the trees. Per open market, if central banks sell a lot of their products and or services, that doesn't mean commercial banks demand it, so deflation could happen. The second con is how when central banks rely too much on the open market and when they suddenly change to the traditional market, they might find it hard to adjust. The third one is if commercial banks buy a lot of products, a lot of securities from central banks, it could lead to inflation because central bank will realize that majority of commercial banks demand their securities, so they increase the price. For reserve requirements, the first con is central banks might find it a challenge to use their savings for investments because they are too focused on paying back what they owe to commercial banks and spending on sudden needs. The second one is how the ratio of their savings, specifically the saving of what they need to pay back to commercial banks and the saving for sudden needs, it won't always be equal ratio because anything could happen. They could suddenly spend on sudden needs, and that could lead to a major downfall in their saving. The third one is when central banks don't have a strict regulation, it could lead to them using the saving for paying back what they owe to use it for sudden spendings instead, and that could even lead to them losing clients of commercial banks. Positive attitude and open-minded viewpoints when facing the challenges of the three monetary policies. For interest rate adjustments, when commercial banks buy from central banks during when the discount rates are low, they shouldn't view it as a loss because even though they pay more, they are contributing to the economic growth. The second one is when central banks increase their discount rates, meaning demand will be high. Commercial banks shouldn't view it as something negative that they are contributing to the environment, because even if it's correct that they are affecting the environment, if the product and or service that they buy includes those that have currency, because it needs paper and wood needs to be cut down. They shouldn't view it as something negative though, because in a way the central bank will be able to predict how their adjustments in discount rates affect the environment and they could know how to avoid it. For open market, the first one is when the central bank feels like they are relying too much on the open market. They should change that perspective into wanting to be more experienced from that opportunity, so it will enable them to not rely too much on the open market and be more flexible when changing markets. The second one is when inflation affects the price of products and or services. Commercial banks shouldn't view it as something negative. Instead, they should view it as an opportunity to buy the products and or services, because even though they are buying it in a price that is higher than before, that just means it will continue to increase. So once it reaches a certain amount of money, they can sell it and earn more profit. For reserve requirements, the first one is when central banks find it a challenge to use their savings for investment. They should change that perspective into a motivation. The second one is when central banks find it a challenge to ensure their savings are used according to its needs. They should view it with a sense of resilience instead, because with that, no matter how many challenges they face, they could rise above it, and it could even make them understand how sudden expenses occur from past sudden expenses. They could predict future sudden expenses. This is the consideration of multiple perspective. You could see the definition of classical perspective, which is a perspective that believes the economy will work itself out when encountering problems. The example is how in good times, where the world isn't experiencing any problem like pandemics or maybe climate problems that makes prices and or wages to rise, and how in bad times, meaning when the world is experiencing problem as a whole, it causes prices and or wages to fall. For interest rate adjustments, in the classical perspective, they believe that central banks don't need to adjust discount rates in order for interest rates to rise, because they believe that the market will adjust itself according to what is happening in the world. For example, if a certain product and or service that central bank offers is trending, that automatically influence commercial banks to demand the products. For the open market, the perspective believes that it is necessary to have an open market in order for an economy to thrive, because it is free from old regulations that the traditional market offers, and that can make it hard to be flexible and to try new things. For reserve requirements, the example was stated when I state the meaning of classical perspective, and it's how the economy will work itself out when encountering problems, like how in good times wages and prices rise, but in bad times they fall. For the monetarist perspective, they believe that money supply, physical currency, deposits, and credits is the main factor affecting demand in an economy, or in simple terms, the economical performance can be controlled with the money supply. For interest rate adjustments, the perspective believes that when interest rates is increased because of central banks controlling the discount rates, which is a form of controlling money supply, then commercial banks will have the tendency to save the money, because when interest rates are high, typically central banks will increase the price, and commercial banks typically don't want to pay more. For open market, they believe that it's best to use nominal GDP to control money supply, because when analyzing nominal GDP, they get to know how sales affect the economy. In the perspective of reserve requirements, they believe that when requirements to save money by the central banks increase, then more liquidity can happen, because that means central banks will need to give out what they owe to commercial banks more. It is also a form of fast liquidity, because commercial banks just need to wait for the central bank to give the money they owe, and commercial banks don't need to pay extra fee, so it's fast liquidity because they get it directly. So application in different contexts. So in the context of sociology, they believe that a growing economy, which is the goal of monetary policies, is essential for changes in social life, human behavior, and social change, because with a growing economy, it enables different infrastructures, organizations, educations, just different fields in general to grow. Because when those different fields grow, people will adapt to it, and it could influence them as a person. In the context of world history, they believe that the concept of money will ensure growth in wealth, because even though they didn't have cash yet, the concept of trading a product for another product is exactly how the concept of money works. They thought that trading is a key for growth in wealth, because they get to access different products.